The wind was a thief in Jericho Fork, a dry, rasping thing that stole the moisture from a woman's lips and the hope from her heart. It scoured the plains, carrying grit that settled in the folds of Alara's worn dress and the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. For a week, she had been a ghost in this town, a widow with no coin and even less charity to her name. Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile had stopped her credit. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Gable, had looked right through her this morning, her gaze as hard and unforgiving as the parched earth. Desperation was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, forcing her breath into shallow, panicked draws. There was only one door left to knock on, a place the townspeople spoke of in whispers, the remote ranch of Silas Blackwood, a man as grim and isolated as the rock-strewn land he worked. She found him by the corral, his back to her as he worked a stubborn knot from a leather strap. He was tall, built of the same unyielding material as the landscape, his movements economical and sure. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting his long shadow toward her like a warning. For a long moment, she couldn't make a sound, her plea a shard of glass in her throat. He must have sensed her, for he stopped his work and turned slowly. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, his eyes a pale, piercing gray that seemed to take in her frayed cuffs, her hollowed cheeks, her entire wretched state in one silent inventory. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply waited. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice a reedy tremor she barely recognized as her own. I am in need of work. Any work. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I'm a hard worker. I swear it." The rehearsed words tumbled out, thin and useless against the vast, indifferent silence of his property. He continued to watch her, his expression unchanging. She felt stripped bare under that gaze, her pride peeling away to reveal the raw terror beneath. "Please," she whispered, the single word a final, desperate prayer. "I have nowhere else to go." He wiped his hands on a cloth, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He walked the short distance that separated them, stopping a few feet away. The scent of dust, sweat, and leather clung to him. He was a creature of this hard land, and she was a wilting flower about to be ground into its soil. He looked past her, toward the dying sun, then back to her face. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It held no pity, only a strange, stark finality. "I have a job for you," he said. Relief, dizzying and fierce, surged through her. But it died just as quickly, choked by his next words. "Only if you'll marry me. By sunset." The world tilted. The wind seemed to mock her, whipping a strand of hair across her face. It was a cruel jest, a proposition so monstrous it defied comprehension. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of madness or malice, but found only a flat, unreadable calm. This was not a proposal of the heart. It was a transaction cold and absolute. He was not offering a hand to save her, but a cage. Yet, as she looked back toward the smug, shuttered windows of Jericho Fork, she knew what awaited her there. The leering eyes of men who saw a lone woman as prey, the slow, grinding starvation of poverty, the utter erasure of her existence. Here, in this man's shocking offer, was a different kind of oblivion, but it was, at least, a kind of survival. The last rays of sunlight were touching the horizon. Her choice had already been made by circumstance. With a voice hollowed out by despair, she gave the only answer she could. Yes. The ceremony was as barren as the land itself. A traveling preacher, a man with weary eyes and a thin book, was found at the town's only saloon and paid $1 for his time. He mumbled the words under the stark, skeletal frame of a half-built barn on the edge of Blackwood's property. Alara stood beside Silas, a stranger bound to her by a desperate vow. She did not look at him. She stared at her own hands, twisting the thin, worn fabric of her dress. There was no ring. There were no witnesses save for the preacher and a sky bleeding into bruised twilight. When it was done, Silas simply nodded at the preacher, who pocketed his coin and disappeared back toward town without a backward glance. The silence that descended was heavier than any sermon. The ride to his ranch house was conducted in that same profound quiet. Alara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, the distance between her and Silas feeling as vast and treacherous as a canyon. The house was like the man. Solid, unadorned, and isolated. It was built of thick timber and stone, hunkered down against the wind. Inside, it was shockingly clean, the pine floors scrubbed, a fire laid but unlit in the stone hearth. It smelled of wood smoke and solitude. He led her not to a shared bedroom, as she had feared with a cold dread coiling in her stomach, but to a small, sparse room at the back of the house. A simple bed with a patched quilt, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto an endless expanse of darkening prairie. "This is yours," he said, his tone flat, informational. He left a bucket of fresh water by the door and then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the short hallway. Alara sank onto the bed, the rough quilt a strange comfort beneath her trembling fingers. This was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for a brute, for a man who would immediately demand payment for his charity. Instead, she was met with a chilling, impenetrable distance. The next morning, he was up before the sun, the smell of coffee and frying bacon reaching her. When she emerged, a plate was set for her at the small wooden table. He ate without speaking, his focus on his food. After, he outlined her duties with the same lack of emotion. There were chickens to feed, a garden to weed, his work clothes to mend. It was the work she had begged for, the work of a hired hand, not a wife. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. He worked from dawn until dusk, his energy seemingly limitless. He moved with a relentless purpose, mending fences, breaking a wild-eyed horse, digging a new well. She watched him from the window or the porch, a silent observer of this silent man. She learned him not through words, but through his actions. She saw the way he was gentle with the horses, his rough hands soothing a nervous flank. She saw how he left a pail of fresh milk on the porch of the widow Jensen, his nearest neighbor 5 miles distant, when he thought no one was looking. He never went to town. Supplies were delivered once a month by a freight wagon, the driver exchanging only a few necessary words with Silas before hurrying away. He was an island, and he had made her a resident of his solitary shore. Her fear began to slowly, imperceptibly, recede, replaced by a deep, gnawing confusion. The marriage was a sham, a legal document filed away and forgotten. He demanded nothing of her but the work, and in return, he provided a roof, food, and a strange, profound security. He was a wall between her and the world, and she could not fathom why he had built it. The answer arrived on a blistering afternoon a month later, cloaked in dust and self-importance. A buggy, far too fine for these rough roads, rattled its way up the long track to the ranch house. Alara was hanging laundry, the clothespin stiff in her cold fingers, when she saw it approach. Her heart seized. She recognized the driver instantly, Mr. Henderson, the mercantile owner, the man whose initial kindness had soured into something predatory after her husband's death, his offers of credit becoming tangled with oily suggestions. He had been the reason she had finally fled her small rented room in town. Silas was at the far end of the property, a distant figure working on a fence line. She was alone. Henderson pulled the buggy to a halt, his portly frame squeezed into a waistcoat that strained at the buttons. He surveyed the property with a proprietary air, his gaze landing on Alara with a slick smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well now, Alara, found yourself a new perch, I see," he said, his voice carrying an easy condescension. "A bit rustic for a woman like you, isn't it?" He climbed down, his boots sinking into the dust. "Blackwood's a strange one. I'm sure he could use a woman's touch, but I've come to collect what's owed." Not to him. To me. He took a step closer, his intent as clear and ugly as the sweat beading on his upper lip. "You left town with a debt. I'm a patient man, but I expect payment. One way or another." Panic? cold and sharp, pierced through her. She backed away, her hands clutching a damp sheet as if it were a shield. "I have nothing," she stammered. "Then you'll have to work it off," he said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I'm sure we can come to an arrangement your employer needn't know about." It was then that a shadow fell over them. Silas had approached without a sound, his long strides eating up the distance from the fence line. He wasn't breathing heavily, but there was a stillness in him that was more menacing than any outward rage. He simply stood between Alara and Henderson, a silent, unmovable obstacle. Henderson, startled, tried to recover his bluster. "Blackwood, just having a word with your new housekeeper. A private matter of some debt she owes me." Silas's gaze didn't flicker. His voice was dangerously quiet. "She's not my housekeeper," Henderson laughed. A short, unpleasant bark. "Oh? And what is she then? Don't tell me you've taken to charity." Silas took a small, deliberate step forward, crowding the other man. He didn't raise his voice, but every word landed like a hammer blow. "She's my wife." He let the words hang in the hot, still air. Henderson's face went slack with shock, then flushed with angry disbelief. "Wife? That's impossible." "There was no announcement. The law doesn't require one," Silas stated, his pale eyes fixed on the man. "Just a preacher and a signature, both of which we have. She is Mrs. Blackwood, and this is my land. Her debts are her own, but her person is under my protection. You will leave now." The authority in his voice was absolute. For a moment, Henderson seemed ready to argue, but something in Silas's unblinking stare made him reconsider. He saw the truth there, the legal, unbreakable barrier that had just been erected. With a venomous glare at Alara, he clambered back into his buggy, muttering threats she couldn't hear. He wrenched the reins and disappeared in a cloud of furious dust. Alara stood frozen, the damp sheet slipping from her grasp. She looked at Silas, at the rigid line of his back, and everything fell into place. The proposal, the distance, the isolation. It hadn't been a cage. It had been a fortress. The dust settled, leaving behind a silence that was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not empty or tense, but filled with the weight of revelation. Alara looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time. The harsh lines of his face seemed less severe now, etched not by cruelty but by a lifetime of solitary resolve. He turned from the road, his shoulders losing a fraction of their rigid tension. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than stoicism in their depths. A quiet, searching vulnerability. He flexed his right hand, and she saw a thin line of blood welling up on his knuckles where he must have gripped a fencing tool too tightly on his walk over. Without a word, she went inside, returning with a clean cloth and a small bowl of water from the basin. He watched her approach, unmoving, as if uncertain of her intent. She stopped before him and gently took his hand. It was calloused and warm, a hand that knew nothing but hard work. He did not pull away. She carefully, tenderly, washed the cut, her touch a question he did not answer with words. The harsh afternoon sun softened as it began its descent, bathing the porch in a gentler, golden light. "My mother," he said, his voice low, startling her after the long quiet. "After my father passed, a man in town held our deed. He thought it gave him rights to more than just the land." He stared out at the horizon, his words sparse but painting a complete and painful picture. "She wasn't strong enough to fight him. I was just a boy. I couldn't stop it." He looked down at their hands, at her small fingers cleaning his wound. "I saw him watching you in town, Henderson. I saw the same look in his eyes. A man like that, he doesn't see a person. He sees a property, unclaimed." The puzzle of his actions was complete. The marriage was not an act of possession, but its exact opposite. It was a shield, forged in the fire of his own past, offered to a stranger because he recognized the shadow of the wolf at her door. He had given her his name, the only protection the world would recognize, to ensure she would never be seen as unclaimed property again. She finished her task, her fingers lingering on his for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He met her eyes, and the vast distance that had defined their existence collapsed in that single shared glance. A partnership had been born not of vows spoken before a preacher, but of a quiet, profound act of defense. Her transformation was no longer about mere survival. It was about finding strength, not just in herself, but in the unexpected sanctuary of another's protection. Standing there, on the porch of their silent home, with the endless prairie stretching before them, Elara knew she was no longer a ghost. She was Mrs. Blackwood, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the hopeful, resilient promise of a sunrise.